Hi guys, it's Emily from Novel Novels and welcome to today's video. This is how have my reading changed? Or has my reading changed? I think I'm going to go with has my reading changed. You know me, I'm a little bit different. So, at the end of December I finished my book journal. Now I'm not going to show you the front, it's unfortunately, we're going to ignore the Harry Potter thing, but I've had this journal since January 2020 and I finished it at the end of December 2024, so it's lasted 4 years. And I spoke to Chris and I was like, let's look at how my reading's changed, let's think about how it's gone and see if it has changed. And I thought I'm going to go through in a bit more detail this 2020, because that was the first year I used this journal. Not my first year on BookTube, but first year I actually wrote all my books down. I thought I'd have a look at how the genres have changed, how I rated, what I classed the genres, and how I wrote in my journal. And it's not a journal as in detail, but maybe I should. I always wonder whether I should do more detailed journals like everyone does, but because I read quite a lot, I've never really been one for writing down all my reviews, because if I wrote down a review for every single book, that would take up way more time than I would like. And I find writing very hard. Recently I've been, my mum and myself has been talking about the fact that I think I've got dyspraxia, and we think we've always had it because we've been looking into Thomas having it, and so I think for me that has affected the way I write. It does affect my fine and gross motor skills, but it's also meant that holding a pen's harder and writing it down. So reading for me has been my form of escape. As you well know, reading is my escape. It's been my escape with my chronic pain. It's been my escape because it's the one thing that I can do well. I love reading, although I do read fast, as you well know by my numbers. So I'm trying this year to read slower and read a lot more of what I want to read. So as you well know, at the moment, my key favourite genres for a lot of my reading has been historical fiction, but contemporary has been the winner over the last year. And I think that's been because 2024 was a really shitty year. So I noticed that obviously I read a lot more contemporary and I read less historical fiction. So I thought I would go into this and have a look at what I read when I started off and talk a bit about some of the books that I read in that. Now obviously I'm going to be mainly focusing on the first year because I don't want this video to be too long. I'm going out for lunch today. So I thought I would mainly focus on 2020. But I'll have a little look at the other years. But do you want me to do more videos of this where I go over the other years I've been on BookTube and looking back on how my reading has changed? Because I'm going to focus on just 1 year because I think that's a bit more practical. But let me know in the comments down below, do you want me to talk about other years and go over it a lot more? And do you want me to go over my book journal more? Do you want me to look at what I've read, what favourite books, that kind of thing? I'd love to know. So the first book, I thought I'd tell you the first book that I finished and read, the first book that went in this journal was actually Our Doris by Charles Heathcote. It's one of the books I've read the most. I haven't actually reread it this year yet. I really want to. I might at some point this year. Normally I reread it every January, but kind of thought I'd give other books a reread chance. But yeah, I love that book. It was the first 5-star, and it was just, Charlie's writing just doesn't disappoint, and it's not just because Charlie's a friend as well. I have noticed that in January I only read a couple of, I classed contemporaries differently. We looking at this, I classed contemporaries differently. And I'd only read 2 contemporaries in January. According to this, I read more fantasy again. Fantasy was quite popular. It was the first time I read Noughts and Crosses, which I need to reread because Mia thinks I'm very cool. My daughter says, have you, books that she's reading for English, and she's like, oh, I've heard about Noughts and Crosses, and I'm like, I've read it, I loved it, I've got it. And she was like, oh, it's one of the only books she's borrowed from me, yet to get it back. But, you know, it was there's books that she's now interested in, so it's quite cool that I've noticed that. I'm only going to point out some of the books that sort of stand out to me. I read some poetry that month. But I was predominantly focused on historical fiction. But I classed YA, I rated YA, all of my YA books were jumped together. So it wasn't YA fantasy, YA contemporary. It was just YA. And middle grade was again middle grade. It wasn't middle grade classics, contemporaries. Middle grade, back then, was just middle grade. It wasn't middle grade classic. Now that I sort of jump all my middle grade in with my classics, contemporaries, fantasies. More of my, these days I'm reading more middle grade fantasy, but back then it was certainly classed as just middle grade. It was the first time I read A Hearts of Fierce and Broken. That was another favourite. We all know that Bridget Kemner is still one of my favourite authors. I had a flop, a historical fiction, which was George and Arthur by Julian Barnes. I don't think I'm ever going back to the author's work. It's the first time I read David Copperfield. I need to go back and read that, but that still scares me because it was my biggest book that I read that month. I read my first Kira Mead with Hargreaves. But historical fiction was really that. I hardly read any contemporaries in January, which, looking back on that, it just seems so different to what I would normally read. I rated Circe historical fiction. Now I think I class Circe as fantasy. What do you think? I'd love to know. So again, I read hardly any contemporaries in that first month, which really does surprise me. In February, I read a lot more classics and historical fiction. My first book of February, actually, I will tell you my first and last. My last book in January was actually The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas by John Boyne, which I know would absolutely, it was 5 stars, it destroyed me. So the first and last book were 5 stars. The first book of February 2020 was Jo's Boys by Louisa May Alcott, and I rated that 4 stars. I need to go back and reread that because I think that would be quite interesting to reread that. I read my first Margaret Atwood, and looking back now, I wouldn't even think about reading Margaret Atwood again. And that was just not for me. I read a lot more classics. Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is really weird. Lady Chatterley's Lover I read then, and I've only just read Sons and Lovers, which I'll tell you more about in my wrap-up, but I liked Sons and Lovers way more than this. I read a lot more non-fiction. Non-fiction was another thing that I read quite a lot of back then, but classics were really sort of standing out in then. And historical fiction again. There wasn't, like, I put Celeste Ng as contemporary fiction, that's fair enough. But, I don't know. I read my first Alison Weir, that's really weird. I didn't like C.S. Lewis's The Horse and the Boy. I still don't like that book. But again, I was starting to read more, I've got a couple of contemporaries, but the good thing is, the last book in February was actually The Worst Witch by, The Worst Witch book. By the Wishing Star. I really love The Worst Witch. I would love to go back and read those, but I'm a bit too old to reread The Worst Witch. But that was 5 stars. That was my shortest book, and that was 5 stars. So I started on a 4 and ended on a 5. So going into March 2020, I read a lot of middle grade, so you can tell I was actually really going for middle grade March that year. So this was the year that I was really into all of the readathons, and I read quite a lot. So you could tell by my reading taste. So March that month, I read a lot of middle grade. I started off with The First Pages and Co book, which was 5 stars. Again, I'm not surprised. I was reading the Philip Pullman books then. Me and Jen were supposed to do a readathon for that, and I need to reread those because that would be good. Oh, Sweet Snoring. Oh, what other books have stood out to me in this book? So I read The Girl Who Stole an Elephant by Nazira Farouk. That was quite a good one. I like that. Queenie. I read Queenie for the first time. I'm looking at this and it's like remembering the first time. I loved Queenie. I really want to reread Queenie. So that's one I do really want to reread. The other Bennett Sister I don't think I kept that. That was another book I remember reading. I remember loving that. I was rereading all the Anne of Green Gables books, and I was loving those. They were like classics, and they were classics, so I don't think I wrote them as classics. I read my first Anne Bronte, The Tenant of Barker Hall. That's gonna be fun. And I read some Neil Morris, but middle grade was a really big thing that month, and that was the thing. But the last book of the month was a flop. It was my Elizabeth Gaskell, Cousin Phyllis and Other Stories, and it was only 2 stars. But I read 26 books in March, so I've actually read more over the years, although I should try and read a bit less, but I should try and do a bit more. Why do I beat myself up at how much I read? I'm trying to focus on other things, but I like reading, so why do I beat myself up? So April, I read a lot more thrillers, and I think April that year there was a readathon going on about thrillers. I think it was someone that used to be on BookTube was running a readathon about thrillers, and I read a lot of thrillers that month. And looking back now, I don't tend to read very many more. I like mysteries, So that's changed. I used to like a lot more thrillers, but now I don't really. Again, as to whether I read that because I was trying to fit in with the crew, because I remember back then I read what I thought other people would want me to read, not necessarily what I wanted to read, and I tried to fit in other people's pigeonholes, which is different. I started the month with Jam Busters by Julia Summers, which I believe was a library book, and that was only 3 stars. Read Book Lovers by Debbie Tongue, I remember that, and that was April was a couple of months after my op, so God, it's really weird, like looking back. 2020, I don't even know how I've not remembered that, but yeah, 2020 was the year obviously COVID, and it was the year of my op, and April 2020 we were all in lockdown, weren't we? So I read a lot that month. How the hell? And I read Charlie's book. The third book of the month was Charlie's book, An Heir to Murder, which I bought straight away and I read and I loved it. That was 5 stars. Other books. So we've got other books that sort of thinking about standing out. See if I've got any flops. I've read Villette by Charlotte Bronte, which I didn't like as much. It was only like 3 stars. Still, I can't remember if I reread that one. Wonder Smith by Jennifer Townsend. I got that as 5 stars. What thrillers did I read? Okay, hang on a minute. I've got The Couple Next Door by Cherie LePena. That was 4 stars. Another thriller was The Cuckoo. Yeah, I'm not going to know that one. It was one of the authors we don't talk about. I read The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley, and that was 4.5 stars. That was my highest rating thriller of the month. I still read like some Roald Dahl, which again I wouldn't necessarily read him again. And my last book of the month was a thriller, and that was The Raoki Girls by Amy Engel, which I remember was quite a good thriller, and I rated that 5 stars. So again, I started the month on a 3 and ended on 5. So that's, that was good. May 2020, I read a lot of YA and non-fiction. YA was a big thing back then, and I do still like YA, but I like YA fantasy, not as much YA contemporary now. And I don't really read as much non-fiction. I probably should read more. My first book of the month, and that was because in May, it was supposed to be some other old booktubers were hosting May Mental Healthathon, and that was a readathon in May. And I remember that being hosted, and I remember doing it like I vlogged that readathon, and actually those readathon vlogs actually still get some of my highest rating videos, which is quite scary. So I don't think anyone does mental health. I think people do. In June, I know that Marilyn Maya Mendoza talks about mental health, and she does that in May actually as well. But May for us, I do Spoonies now, so that's what I do. So that kind of is my thing for then. But the first book I read that month was The Shock of the Fall by Nathan Fiedler, and that was YA, but I would say it's a contemporary. Now I would class it as a contemporary, and that was 4 stars. And I read The Prison Doctor by Amanda Brown, which I've got on my shelf still, and I still need to reread that. So that was quite a lot of non-fiction. Oh God, definitely sort of like looking at this. I read a lot of YA contemporaries, which again nowadays I wouldn't necessarily read, and I'm starting to I put contemporaries. I separated contemporaries into contemporary and chick lit, and I don't know why I did it that way. Now, chick lit is not a term that we like using. It's like a but it's not a sort of completely wrong terminology. And I don't know why I did it back then, but you can't beat yourself up. That was what I was like. That's why I checked that how I wrote it. Non-fiction, yes, definitely. I was reading like Happy by Fern Cotton, so I was reading a lot more about non-fiction about mental health that month, and that was quite good. I read The Amber Spyglass. So I read even more Philip Pullman. Philip Pullman there. The Amber Spyglass was like a favourite book. I read loads in that month, like 30, I say loads, it's 31 books, it feels like it was loads. I borrowed a lot of books from the library, so that was a big thing. I'm trying to see if there's any books that sort of stand out. Oh God, here we go. I read The Mercies for the first time, and I'm rereading that now. That's really weird to look at. I rated it 5 stars then, and I'm still going to rate it 5 stars now. And I listened to that on audiobook, I remember that. I also wrote down my audiobooks. Now I don't really do that, which I know I should. I've been told off many a time for not doing that. Although at the moment I can't do my audiobooks because my BorrowBox app's down. The last book of the month that month was Vivian's Heavenly Ice Cream Shop by Abby Clements, and that was 4 stars. So again, not too bad. I can definitely tell I was reading about mental health that month. I'm definitely glad I'm only doing this as 2020 because this video is already quarter of an hour long. Fudge. Right, so June 2020, I had 3 2-stars and a DNF. But 2 of the books that I read in June that year were 2 of my favourite books ever, and actually ones that I need to reread, actually. So, yes, that's quite cool. My first book of June was actually Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which was the first time I read that. I only rated 4 stars the first time, but now it's 5. I read The Black Shelf for the first time, and I read The 13th Tale, which I gave away my copy of the 13th Tale, and now I want it back. Now I want to rebuy it because it's actually one I do want to reread. This is what I mean. The only thing, a problem about giving away my books is sometimes when I read books and I keep them for a while, I think, oh, will I reread it? And then sometimes I give them away and then I'm like, actually, I want to reread that. This is why I'm doing the reread thing, because it does help me work out if I want to keep reread them again. I read the first of the 2 stars was Sophie's World by Justine Gardner. It was philosophy, biggest pile I've ever read. Hated it. Read another Charlie book. I DNF Captain Corelli's Mandolin. I don't regret that. I never go near that author's books again. I read another one of my favourite books that's ever. Let's have a look. So that was one of the other books. With Mallory Towers. My other floppy one was Elizabeth Gilbert's Committed. I do not like Elizabeth Gilbert's writing. Again, that's not for me at all. I'm like, just look, yeah, not doing that. I did have a Jennifer Weiner that was only 3 stars. See, I had and the Debs of Bletchley Park. I thought that was a historical fiction. It was actually a non-fiction, so I flopped on that one. And the last book of the month was a floppy book, and that was God in Ruins by Kate Atkinson. I loved Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, but God in Ruins I didn't like as much, and that one only rated at 3 stars. So for July, I'm guessing, it looks like here I did a lot of classics, so I definitely did Jane Austen in July then. Which was why I did Pride and Prejudice 4, I don't have a clue. But I also, I started changing the way I wrote my genres. So like historical fiction, if it was a translated book, because I used to write translated books as just as translated, not the actual genre the translation was in. So now I've started writing historical fiction, translated, or whatever else, translated. So my first book of the month was actually a Nicholas Sparks one, A Walk to Remember, that was 4 stars. I had a floppy one that I can't even remember that. I can't even. Some of the books I can't read my writing. The Librarian of Auschwitz I didn't like at all. I didn't like that one. What was the classics I was talking about? Northanger Abbey. I read Northanger Abbey. I read Nancy Mitford. I didn't like. How to Find Love in a Cold Climate. That was a floppy classic that month. Northanger Abbey I only rated it 3 stars, so I can't remember if I reread that. No, I think I need to reread Northanger Abbey this Jane Austen July, because I didn't like that as much. So that only rated it 3 stars. I read some William Wordsworth poems for classics. That was quite good. Lady Susan and Watson's, I only rated that 3 stars. So again, my big one of the month, I did love Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. The Austen Girls by Lucy Worsley. There were 2 of the big ones. I did read Dear NHS by Adam Case. That was all the letters because of COVID, and I read that and I loved that. And here we go. So I think that the last book of that looks like that was here. So let's just see. I read 39 books. That was probably one of my biggest months I read in July, but that was definitely in the middle of COVID. What other classics did I read? Persuasion. I like that one more. That was a reread. I reread that one. I got 4 stars. Whereas the first time I read it, I flopped it. Read some contemporaries. Trying to see if there's any other favourites. DNF'd The Trouble with Rebecca Shaw book. I don't remember why. I don't even remember that book, so it tells you that. Still read more Kieran Wilde Hargreaves. That's definitely an author I liked. My last book of the month was The Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. It was 5 stars. I've got my own copy. I do actually want to reread that because it was very different to what I've normally read, and I did enjoy it. August, we didn't have any readathons, but I'm starting to read more contemporaries. But again, historical fiction was still the biggest thing. So my first book of the month was In the Midst of Life by Jennifer Worth, which was non-fiction. So that was good. I read a thriller, 5 stars, The T.M. Logan, The Catch. I listened to that on audiobook. I wouldn't read that again, excuse me. See if I got some fantastic. The Bookshop on the Shore by Jenny Colgan. That was a 5 star, and I need to do, like I said, I am still rereading Jenny Jenny Colgan's books because I do like them. Favourites on the Edge of the Shore. Right, so there's more thrillers again. The Hunger Games I read. I borrowed that and I like 5 stars. I wouldn't read the Hunger Games again now. It's not a book I would read. Contemporaries, I've got some more like little bookshop. Oh god, here we go. I'm trying to remember. I read Cinderella's Dead for the first time by Kaelin Byron. I loved that. That was a favourite and it's still one of my favourites. I read North and South for the first time and that I still loved it on the reread. It was very depressing by Elizabeth Gaskell, but it was a favourite. Reread The Borrowers. My last book of the month was a fantasy, The Beast Within by Serena Valentina, and that was a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. That was 4 stars, but now I think I've kept that. I read a couple of horrors actually that month as well. I read Stephen King, but I've never read Stephen King again. It's just not for me. Like, I had a couple of other high 5 stars, but that was just 2 stars. That was not for me at all. Obviously read a Paige Sheen, you know I love hers. So now we go to September. And I've got a note that I did used to log my ebooks and audiobooks. I don't read ebooks anymore. That's not something for me. It's just not. I totally recommend it because I've only got a phone. I don't have an e-reader or an ebook or anything, or a Kindle or anything. So I only have my phone for BorrowBox. So for me, it's too small, the print, and I am getting older. So yeah, I do listen to my audiobooks when my BorrowBox app is finished. My BorrowBox app, I need to get it all sorted because I've lost it. I changed my library card and I've not worked out how to put my new library card on it. But I am listening to audiobooks and I will get off my bum and put them back on here. But I did used to read more of the ebooks, but as I'm getting older, it's harder to do. But I read more historical fiction again in September that year. First book I read that month was Love on the Rocks by Veronica Henry, and that was 4 stars. I was still reading the rest of my series. I would listen to those on audiobook. What other ones have I got? A Floppy Was Boxed by Christina Doucher. God, I've never read that again as well. It's funny just like looking at this and going, oh, how much does that change? I read The Founding. I read a Stacey Hall back at, I can't even remember where I wrote down that I read my first Stacey Hall. Oh, in the April that year, I read my first Stacey Halls, which was The Foundling, The Familiars, and I loved that. And I reread another one, The Foundling, and I enjoyed that as well. So Stacey Hall, this was the year Stacey Halls came into my life with her books. And I was just, oh my goodness, totally blew my mind. I read Test for the first time, so I got a great rate, that 4 stars. I started reading, I put the audiobooks of the Nickel Boys, I listened to that. I read the Pull of the Stars on the ebook by Emma Donoghue, and I've gone right off her. That's nothing. I need to sell a book and just need to work out how I'm going to sell it. Right, so The Hypnotist Love Story by Leanne Moriarty. I read that. I was really into Leanne Moriarty back then. DNF, the other Alcott, yeah, that was a book I did not like either. That was an ebook. Why I'm no longer talking about talking to white people about race. That was an interesting non-fiction book that I read. I read that 5 stars. The History of Love by Nicole Klaus. God, I remember not liking that. But the last book that I read was, The Flop. It was a 2-star book, The History of Love by Nicole Klaus, I don't know how to say that. That was a flop. Obviously October. I'm pretty sure October I did Booktober. It was a lot more classics. And I read a couple of horrors because that was obviously spooky season. So the first book I read, actually, though, was actually a classic, a contemporary, because obviously classics take longer to read. And What's the Girl Gonna Do by Holly Bourne. I remember loving Holly Bourne books, but I haven't kept them. They're more YA contemporary. That was another thing. I wrote YA contemporary on that. And then I read my first Juno Dawson, Margot and Me by Juno Dawson. That was historical fiction. I don't know why I wouldn't have thought that. My first classic of the month was actually Black Beauty, which I loved. Very Crime and Punishment for the first time. I rated that 3. I think they're still people are still not exactly mad about it. I read Agnes Grey, and Agnes Grey actually got a higher rating in my books than The Descendant of Wildfell Hall. So I think I might need to reread Agnes Grey. Well, it's the one I'm going to recommend for people. It's rated at 5 stars. Jane Eyre, I reread it. I loved it. It was a favourite. 5 stars. And I'm going to be rereading that again soon. And that'll be more about the sneaky peek of something I'm telling you soon, any week now. I read ebooks and audiobooks. I read a few contemporaries because I DNF'd Adam Bede. So I have decided I'm rereading Adam Bede for Victober this year. Because Kate Howe has raved about it a lot, and I'm going to reread it slower over the month. That's going to be my big classic that I'm going to really focus on. So I really want to reread that and really give it a go. Right, here we go. Oh, I read some the Emily Bronte poet. Yes, you can tell I love the Brontes. More of that coming up soon. And I read a couple of horrors. And Carrie, I read another Stephen King. Why the hell did I put myself through horrors when I hate them now? Actually, according to this, my most read genre was actually historical fiction. But I read 3 horrors and 9 classics. The last book of the month was From Home by Veronica Henry. It was 4 stars, but it was probably what I needed to keep up with this. Coming to the end of this now, it's November on 2020, and I read more horrors again, but I started reading a lot more contemporary and fantasy. The first book I read was Queen Victoria's Matchmaking, which was non-fiction. I'm guessing I did non-fiction November, which I know is stopping now. I read The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell, and I rated that 5 stars, and I remember that scaring the bejeebers out of me. I read some Cecilia Ahern, that was quite good. Let's have a look at anything else that's sort of standing out. I love going. I am really enjoying going through this. I'll put the book away though, because I need to have some room in my cupboard. So I'm seeing if there's anything else that sort of stands out. Maggie O'Farrell, I read one of hers that I didn't love. That was like The Hand That First Held Mine. That's not my favourite by her. Pet by Quaker Maisie. I read that. I borrowed that from somewhere, and I loved that. It was 5 stars. And I don't have my own copy of that. And I love a Quaker Maisie's book, so I want to get my own copy of that. And the last book of the month was I'll Take New York by Miranda Dickinson. It was a flop. It was only 3.5 stars. The last 5 stars of the month was actually Snowflakes and Cinnamon Swirls in the Winter Wonderland by Heidi Swain. And I love Heidi Swain's books. So that was actually my last 5 stars of the month. So according to this, I read 8 non-fiction books that month. I was actually starting to write down on here. And 9 historical fiction. And contemporary, again, there were so much less. I actually read a lot less contemporary in those early days. And last but not least, December. So if you want me to do these for other years, please let me know in the comments down below. Or if you want me to do a vote, that would be quite good. Right, so the first book I read of that month was The Secret of Birds and Bees by Kira Millward Hargreaves. It was a 5 star. It was a book I was sent in as an PR product, but it wouldn't have changed my rating. I love that book. It's 5 stars all the way. It's the first of the fantasies, and I read another Sophie Anderson fantasy as well. So that was a big thing up. I just read loads of 5 stars. It was loads of 5-star fantasies and things like that. I read an Elaine Everest that's 5 stars as well. That was good. Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey Miss Kristen. I read that for the first time and loved that. Curse the Dark and Lonely. I reread it again. I reread that and still rated 5 stars. I can't remember why I reread that. I think it was because the 3rd book in the series was coming out. I DNF'd 13 by Steve Kavanagh. I'm not going to try reading those books again. It's just not for me at all. I read loads of historical fiction. I read some I started reading more Christmas books, which was quite interesting. Christmasaurus by Tim Fletcher. And I read some Christmas Jenny Colgan. But my last book of the month was The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel by Deborah McGorra. That was 3 stars. But and I had a flop, which was The Christmas Surprise by Justine Fletcher. No, never to touch that. My last 5 star of the month, though, was Hollowpox, which eventually I believe that book's coming out, but yeah. So that is January, and that is 2020, looked over 2020. And let's see. I think because of the fact that my reading tastes have changed, and I know that I've gone down more contemporary now than historical fiction, I know that I've changed, although it does look like fantasy has always been a key genre for me. So I thought I'd only just got back into it, but it actually looks like it's been at my core, which I quite love. If you got to the end of this video, leave me a tree emoji, because trees grow and plants grow. So if you leave me a tree emoji, that would be quite good. And let me know, have your reading taste changed? I'd love to talk to you about it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel, not subscribed yet, ring on my ding-a-ling. I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.